June 19, 1944. Philippine Sea dawn breaks cold and metallic over the Philippine Sea. On the flat-top's deck, crewmen heave 50 caliber belts into the waiting wings of Grumman F6F Hellcats. 6 Brownings per fighter, 400 rounds a gun. The ritual of a Navy morning that means someone won't be coming home. Steam sighs around arresting cables. A yellow shirt's hand snaps forward. Throttles open. The R-2800s cough, then bellow, and blue-gray cats leap into the pale light. In the dim CIC, controllers watch green traces sweep east to west. Enemy raids inbound. Vectoring. Task Force 58's Combat Air Patrol to meet them long before the UE carriers are in sight. It is June 19, 1944. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, under Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, is covering the Saipan landings. Vice Admiral Mark Mitscher's TF-58 carries the air war on its decks. Out there, Jisaburo Ozawa's first mobile fleet rises to contest the sky, and the Hellcats climb to meet it. Guns are armed. Tanks are topped. The first contrails cross at altitude, and brass begins to fall like rain. Because everything that follows will hinge on how these fighters were built, how their pilots were trained, and how the battle was directed. The Hellcat was built for a specific enemy and a specific problem. In 1941-42, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero had carved a legend across the Pacific by trading protection for reach and agility. No pilot armor, no self-sealing tanks on early variants, and light structure to stretch range and turn time. American test and museum records describe how the Zero's controls went heavy at high speed, and how the absence of self-sealing made it fatally vulnerable once hit. Traits U.S. pilots learned to exploit by fighting vertically and fast. Grumman's answer was the F6F Hellcat, an all-new airframe wrapped around the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp. The aircraft first flew on 26 June 1942 and entered service in 1943. By war's end, 12,275 had been produced. Industrial scale that meant squadrons could be kept full and air groups refreshed. The standard fighter fit was blunt and devastating. 6 50 caliber Browning M2s with 400 rounds per gun, 2,400 rounds total, backed by cockpit and systems armor and a self-sealing fuselage tank. Those choices were deliberate. To survive hits, to keep firing, and to give the pilot a robust gun platform at speed and in a dive. Protection and energy, not fragile finesse, defined the type. A bullet-resistant windscreen, 200 T-words. Herod 2040, drawview, T-20 of cockpit armor, armored oil systems, and self-sealing fuel cells were specified precisely because the enemy's early war success had come from machines without those safeguards. The Hellcat's mass and wing plan gave it authority in a power dive and stability in gun passes, where a Zero's ailerons stiffened and its tanks could ignite. The contrast, survivability versus delicacy, was not aesthetic. It was tactical. Grumman then paired the machine with a system. By early 1944, the U.S. fleet fought as a radar-directed organism. Shipboard CICs, Combat Information Centers, fused search radar, voice nets, and fighter direction plotting to stack combat air patrol at the right heights and bearings. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, 19 to 20 June 1944, would become a case study in fighter direction. Raids detected far out, cap vectored to optimal intercepts, and strike trains shredded before they could find the carriers. But the prelude to that mastery began the previous year, when the Hellcat cut its teeth in the Central Pacific raids of 1943. In October 5–6, 1943, U.S. carrier groups under Rear Admiral Alfred E. Montgomery struck Wake Island. Navy communiques and photo records document the operation and the scale of destruction ashore. It was among the first moments the Hellcat appeared in strength from Essex-class decks. and it previewed the new doctrine: massed carriers, coordinated fighter sweeps, and high-speed slashing tactics instead of turning fights. On the human side, the United States built depth. The Navy's training base exploded in throughput, even extending to 2 training carriers on the Great Lakes, USS Wolverine and USS Sable, which together qualified over 17,000 pilots for deck landings between 1942 to 45, creating a pipeline of carrier aviators and deck crews who could sustain operations at a tempo Japan could no longer match. That pipeline mattered. When squadrons rotated forward for Forager, the Hellcat's cockpit was increasingly filled by pilots who had bounced dozens of traps before they ever saw combat. Japan's line could not be replenished as fast. Even Japanese official histories, Senshi Sosho, compiled post-war, record the declining availability of trained IJN aviation personnel as the war moved into 1943-44. Attrition in the Solomons and Central Pacific, fuel scarcity, and the need to disperse training forced the Imperial Navy to send less experienced aircrew into major fleet actions. The quality gap was not an insult. It was a measurable condition that shaped the exchange ratios that followed. The technology plus training model meshed with industrial logistics. The R-2800 itself, an 18-cylinder, 2,800 cu in radial, first run in 1937 and produced in 6 figures, gave the Hellcat the durable power plant it needed for long cap or heavy strike loads, and supported later water injection, 10W, emergency power settings as the F6F matured. The engine's ubiquity across U.S. types simplified spares and maintenance on forward bases and carriers alike. Taken together, the Hellcat was less hot rod than weapon system. A sturdy fighter, a pilot pipeline that didn't run dry, and a fleet that could detect, decide, and direct at range. Where the Zero's early advantage lay in range and instantaneous turn, the Hellcat's advantage lay in survivability, firepower, and energy fighting, and in the doctrine that put those strengths in the right place at the right time. The next section places that system on the map. Operation Forager, the Saipan landings in June 1944, and the order of battle that drew Ozawa's carriers into the Philippine Sea, where the Hellcats would prove the point. The map tightens to the Marianas. Operation Forager begins with the assault on Saipan on 15th of June 1944, the lodgment that would put B-29 fields within striking range of Tokyo. A strategic hinge the Japanese could not ignore. 5th Fleet Commander Admiral Raymond A. Spruance covers the landings, while Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitscher's Task Force 58 turns its flight decks into a moving shield and soared around the beachhead. The dates and the geography are precise. June 15, July 9, 1944 for the ground battle. Sea control required at once. Across the horizon, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa sails with the first mobile fleet under Operation A-Go. His carriers are grouped into forces built around Taihō, Shōkaku, and Zuikaku, with light carriers Chitos, Chiyoda, Zuiho, plus Junyo, Hiyō, Ryuho, backed by battleships including Yamato and Musashi. In theory, the plan is sound. Strike first with longer-ranged carrier aircraft and with hundreds of land-based planes in the Marianas to soften the American screen. In practice, it depends on trained aircrews finding the target and surviving the intercept. Numbers frame the stakes. Contemporary summaries put TF-58 at roughly 15 carriers, 7 fleet plus 8 light, 7 battleships, heavy and light cruisers, and 68 destroyers with 1,900 carrier aircraft aboard. Ozawa can muster 3 fleet, plus 6 light carriers, 5 battleships, and escorts, with around 4,450 carrier aircraft, and perhaps 300 land-based aircraft in the area. The disparity is not merely hulls, it is sortie generation, radar coverage, and pilot experience. That last variable, finding the enemy first, shifts decisively toward the Americans in June 1944. On the U.S. side, shipboard radar fuses into combat information centers, CICs, that plot raid bearings, altitudes and speeds, then vector combat air patrol to meet incoming strikes far from the carriers. Fighter direction is a process, not a guess. Detect, classify, assign, and stack. This doctrine, matured over the Central Pacific campaigns, is one reason the Philippine Sea, 19 to 20 June 1944, becomes an interception battle rather than a knife fight over the decks. Terrain and distance also favor the shield. With Saipan under assault, Ozawa must advance from west of the Marianas into seas where the Americans already have pickets, submarines, and air search out front. TF-58 scouting lines and submarine screens feed the same decision loop that guides the fighters. Meanwhile, the landings fix Japanese intent. To break the invasion, the carriers have to close. That strategic compulsion, Forager, A6M counterstrike, creates the battle space. When the fleets converge, the first decisive blows fall not from above, but from below. On 19 June 1944, USS Albacore, SS-218, fires a spread that fatally wounds Taihō, Ozawa's new armored deck flagship. Hours later, USS Kavala, SS-244, puts torpedoes into Shōkaku, detonating fuel vapors and sending the veteran carrier under. The next day, during Mitscher's dusk push, U.S. carrier aircraft sink Hiyō. 3 carriers lost in roughly 36 hours. A collapse of striking power that magnifies every subsequent Hellcat interception. The causal chain is clear. Saipan's lodgment compels A6M. A6M concentrates a depleted air arm that must fly long over water legs, guided by patchy reconnaissance. U.S. radar, CIC, extends reach, shaping KP kills before Japanese strike groups can even assemble for attack runs. And submarine ambushes strip away Ozawa's best decks, reducing his ability to regenerate strikes across the 2-day engagement. The stage is set for what aviators will forever call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Hellcat's punch was mechanical certainty. 6 wing-mounted 50-caliber Browning M2s, 3 per wing, with 400 rounds per gun, about 2,400 rounds ready to throw a dense, stable pattern through a gun sight at closing speed. The mounts sat outboard for clean harmonization, giving pilots a forgiving firing window in diving high G slashes. The airframe wrapped the pilot in practical shields, bullet-resistant windscreen, armor around vital systems, and self-sealing fuel tanks in the fuselage and, in later models, in the wings, choices meant to keep a damaged fighter flying long enough to bring the pilot home. Across the merge, the A6M Zero had been engineered for reach and turn, not resilience. Early war Zeros lacked pilot armor and self-sealing tanks, trading protection for lightness and range. U.S. testing of captured examples, most famously the Akutan Koga Zero, codified the counter-tactics. Don't turn with it. Hit and run in the vertical where its structure and systems were most vulnerable. Those findings then filtered into training syllabi and squadron briefings across 1942-44. The causal chain is direct. Hellcat survivability plus sustained fire volume, longer firing solutions and higher kill probability, while zero fragility meant that a short, accurate burst could be fatal, often igniting tanks. When multiplied across carrier air groups of hundreds of fighters, that design philosophy scaled into exchange ratios that told their own story over the Marianas. Energy fighting beat mystique. The Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney R2800 gave it the thrust and toughness to dive hard, climb back, and roll with authority at combat speeds, exactly where the Zero's controls stiffened and its never-exceed dive speed margins narrowed. U.S. trials with the captured Zero recorded light Delightful handling around 320 km/h, but warned that above that regime, the aircraft became progressively heavy and vulnerable to high-speed slashing attacks. Numbers framed pilot choices. Typical F6F5 top speed approached 300 Hz, while A6M2 figures clustered near 330 mph, with the Zero's strength in low-speed instantaneous turn and the Hellcats in zoom, roll, and dive. Doctrine translated those graphs into moves. Hellcat sections took altitude and sun, then dropped in with short bursts, resisting the temptation to flatten into a turning contest. The vertical game forced the Zero into its weak envelope, where it was hardest to roll, easiest to overshoot, and most at risk of structural or fuel system failure if struck. Causality here is mechanical. High-speed control authority plus structural margin permitted aggressive dives and pullouts that the Zero couldn't safely mirror, creating one-pass out opportunities. The result on 19 to 20 June 1944 was not just individual duels, but a pattern of intercepts where Hellcats arrived with speed and position, fired once, and disappeared into the vertical before the counterturn could bite. Machines mattered, but systems decided. By mid-1944, U.S. carrier groups fused air search radar to combat information centers, CICs, that plotted raid bearings, altitudes, and speeds, then vectored combat air patrol to meet incoming strikes tens of miles from the task force. Histories of 19 to 20 hours. June 1944 called the Philippine Sea a textbook of fighter direction. Raids detected early, KP stacked by altitude, and intercepts sequenced so that few attackers ever reached the carriers in formed groups. That doctrinal edge sat on top of a human pipeline the IJN could no longer match. In the United States, the Navy qualified well over 17,000, 18,000 carrier landings on the Great Lakes training carriers, USS Wolverine, 964, and USS Sable, 981, between 1942-45, pushing a continuous stream of aviators to the fleet. Many Hellcat pilots reached the war already comfortable with deck handling, hook-downs, and go-arounds, skills that conserved airplanes and pilots during high-tempo operations. Causal chain, radar, CIC detection, efficient vectoring, intercepts far forward, multiplied by a deep bench of trained pilots who could sustain sortie rates day after day. On Ozawa's side, attrition from 1942 to 43 and compressed training produced aircrews less prepared for radar-directed, layered cap. The outcome in June 1944 was not accidental. It was the emergent behavior of a mature system. Hellcats guided by wires and scopes, flown by pilots who had practiced the hard parts before they ever saw the enemy. Mid-1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service could not replace experience as fast as it was losing it. U.S. analysis of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, 19 to 20 June 1944, emphasized that the intercepts succeeded because better-trained Hellcat pilots, directed by practiced fighter controllers, met strike groups long before they reached the carriers. In the Navy's own retrospective, radar-directed caps flown by well-trained aircrews cut the Japanese formations to ribbons. The numbers show why readiness mattered. Ozawa's first mobile fleet sailed with roughly 450 carrier aircraft and access to 300 land-based aircraft in the Marianas, but the Americans put up about 900 carrier aircraft, from 7 fleet and 8 light carriers in task force. 58. Losses over 2 days were catastrophic for Japan, on the order of 550, 645 aircraft destroyed. Numbers Japan could not replace in pilots or machines at the same tempo. Causality runs through training. Carrier aviation is unforgiving. Deck ops and formation tactics demand hours of rehearsal. The U.S. pipeline, by contrast, had already qualified 17,820 pilots on the inland training carriers USS Wolverine, 1964, and USS Sable, 1981, between 1942-45, creating a deep bench for forward Essex-class decks. When those pilots met long-range AGO strikes after hours of overwater flight and navigation, the readiness gap multiplied every other disadvantage the Japanese faced. So when Hellcat divisions intercepted the first massed raids on June 19th, they weren't meeting a peer force in proficiency. They were meeting strike groups heavily composed of newer crews, flying into a layered defense that had been drilled for months. One reason the exchange ratios on Turkey Shoot Day looked so lopsided. Information turned tactics into results. By June 1944, U.S. carrier task groups fused air search radar with combat information centers, CICs, to detect, classify, and vector cap with precision. A set-piece example of what fighter direction should be, as one technical history describes the Philippine Sea. Controllers stacked altitude brackets, assigned headings and speeds, and launched additional cap in timed waves so the intercepts occurred tens of miles from the carriers, not overhead. Command style made the system decisive. Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, 5th Fleet, kept the fleet focused on covering Saipan. Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitscher, TF-58, optimized carrier employment and the KP umbrella. The radar CIC lattice, paired with ample fighter numbers, meant Ozawa's AGO plan, relying on long-range carrier strikes coordinated with land-based air, met layered resistance from the moment Japanese groups lifted off and tried to assemble. On 19th of June, U.S. fighter direction helped break multiple raid axes from west and from the Guam area before coherent attack runs formed. The doctrine also exploited undersea intelligence and attrition. Submarines feeding contact reports and taking shots stripped Ozawa's striking power. USS Albacore, SS-218, torpedoed Taihō on 19th June 1944, while USS Kavala, SS-244, sank Shōkaku the same day. 2 carriers gone within hours. Every lost deck reduced Japan's ability to rearm, refuel, and launch second-wave strikes, making radar-directed cap even more overwhelming as the battle progressed. Put simply, sensing, decision, vectoring, interception, run at fleet scale turned the Hellcat from a strong fighter into a system weapon. The Hellcat's battlefield dominance rested on factory floors. Grumman built 12,275 F6Fs, 1942-45. Production so intense that, at peak, one Hellcat rolled off the line about every hour. The type entered combat in 1943, maturing into the F6F5 with the R2800 to 10 DW and the standard battery of 650 cal Brownings. Industrial rhythm kept squadrons full, spares flowing, and airframes rotating through combat and overhaul without starving the fleet. Across the water, the Mitsubishi Nakajima A6M Zero, Japan's workhorse, saw total wartime output on the order of 10,739 airframes. That is a formidable figure, but spread across years, variants, and theaters, while also coinciding with a worsening fuel situation and a shrinking cadre of veteran pilots. By 1944, the Zero also lagged its opponents in key metrics like high-speed maneuverability and survivability. No early self-sealing tanks, limited armor. Limitations that industrial scale could not quickly erase. Industrial mass translated to sortie generation and operational stamina. With 7 fleet and 8 light carriers in TF-58 carrying about 900 aircraft into the Philippine Sea, Mitscher could surge large, cap and still retain a strike reserve, then surge again in the evening of 20th of June for the long-range mission Beyond Darkness. confident that enough pilots and machines remain to recover in the dark. Japan's 3 fleet and 6 light carriers, fielding 400 Taihō, 13 50 carrier aircraft, simply could not absorb the losses of 1920 June and regenerate combat power by day 2. This is the quiet logic behind the Poitif. Poitif curtains, factories and fuel dumps as much as dogfights. Production and logistics laid the carpet. Hellcats just walked it. Mid-morning haze lays a bright lid over the Philippine Sea as the first radar plots begin to harden on CIC scopes. Fast, high, and coming in from the west. Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitscher keeps Task Force 58 steady until the last possible minute, then turns his carriers into the wind and throws every Hellcat he can into the sky. Controllers stack the cap in altitude belts. Destroyers extend the radar picket screen. Battleships hold their fire. The clock reads just after 10. The Putin Fuitwin. First Japanese raid, about 68 aircraft, is already inside 150 miles and closing. At 10:36, the lead Hellcats hit them at roughly 70 miles from the fleet. In minutes, 25 attackers are falling for the loss of 1 U.S. fighter. Survivors are chopped up again on the run-in. A handful reach the outer screen and lash at picket destroyers, but none break through to the carriers. The second raid is larger and deadlier if it can hold together. About 107 aircraft, detected just after 11:07. Fighter direction works as advertised. Intercepts begin hot 60 miles out, and the sky becomes a lattice of contrails and tracer. At least 70 attackers are destroyed before they can set up proper attack geometry. A few torpedo aircraft lunge at Enterprise. A detonation slaps her wake instead of her hull. Others streak at Princeton and die. Only 6 manage to press on toward Rear Adm. Alfred E. Montgomery's group. Even these are cut down in the last seconds of their dives. When the fragments blow past, 97 of 107 are gone. The U.S. formation remains intact. In the middle of it all comes a small surgical vignette that will become legend. LTJG, Alexander Vraciu, VF-16, rides his F6F down the slope on a gaggle of D4Y Judy dive bombers. 8 minutes. 6 kills. He lands with 360 rounds expended. Short bursts, hard discipline, and the confidence of a pilot flying a machine that can dive, pull, and shoot at combat speeds without shaking itself apart. The flight deck of USS Lexington, CV-16, catches the moment in a photograph. Vraciu holding up 6 fingers. It is the human face of a systems fight. The third raid, 47 aircraft from the north, tries a different axis. 40 U.S. fighters are waiting at 13U, 50 miles out. 7 attackers fall quickly. Many others sheer off rather than press scattered runs through stacked cap. This time, more of the formation limps away, about 40 making it back to their carriers, but the exchange ratio widens in the Americans' favor. And, more importantly, no decisive attack forms over the task groups. The day's pattern is set. Radar finds, CIC vectors, Hellcats intercept far forward, and Japanese strike packages disintegrate in the approach. The fourth raid never really finds the fleet. Launched around 11:30, its crews are given a faulty position. The strike breaks into 2 groups. One wanders into Montgomery's air umbrella and loses half of its 18 aircraft in a brief, violent tangle. The other heads for Guam and Rota for fuel. At Oroti Field, Guam, 27 Hellcats pounce as they attempt to land. 30 of 49 are shot down, and many of the rest are wrecked on the ground or written off. Somewhere in that aftermath, a pilot on Lexington says what everyone in the after-action debrief is thinking, like an old-time turkey shoot. The nickname will outlive every participant. Even when a single bomb finally does find metal, the U.S. line holds, During the day's first action, a stick punches the deck of USS South Dakota, BB-57, killing and wounding over 50 sailors, but failing to knock the battleship out of formation. The strategic meaning is stark. Across multiple raid axes and hundreds of sorties, the Japanese have yet to land a crippling blow on the carrier core. Task Force 58 is still generating fighters, still recovering and relaunching, still under control. By late afternoon, the wreckage tally has become a verdict. Over June 19th, Japanese losses mount into the hundreds, with U.S. air and shipboard AA credited with a disproportionate share of kills for only light American losses. The day does not end with a clean horizon, though. It ends with smoke pillars on the western rim. Two events, both below the waves, have slashed Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's striking power even more than the failed raids aloft. As Ozawa directs his air groups, USS Albacore, SS-218, drives a torpedo into Taihō, his new armored deck flagship, on the morning of 19th of June. Damage control errors allow volatile fuel vapors to spread. By the afternoon, a catastrophic explosion tears the carrier apart. Meanwhile, USS Kavala, SS-244, stalks Shōkaku and at midday plants 3 hits that detonate aviation fuel and send the veteran carrier under at 11 to 50 EN. 137 degree 57 E. 2 capital decks gone in hours. The fleet's ability to regenerate concentrated strikes is crippled. Here is the causal chain with the numbers to anchor it. Detection at 150 miles leads to intercepts at 70 to 60 miles. 4 major raid cycles dissolve in front of the carriers. Individual acts like Vraciu's 6 in 8 are enabled by stacked cap and fighter direction that puts shooters in position and keeps them supplied with vectors and fuel windows to fight again the same day. Underneath, submarines sever the Japanese fleet's ability to rearm and relaunch in force on day 2. By nightfall on the 19th, the Americans hold airspace and initiative. The Japanese hold a shrinking map. The next move belongs to Mitscher, a long-range dusk strike on June 20th that will push his air groups beyond darkness, and then call the fleet to do something no admiral had ever done in the Pacific War. Turn on the lights. Dawn comes hot and glassy. Through the morning, contact reports are thin. Ozawa is out there, hundreds of miles west-northwest, but the precise bearing slips like heat mirage. By late afternoon, plots finally cohere enough for a gamble. Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitscher makes the call that history will remember. Launch the long strike anyway, at the edge of range, knowing the pilots may have to grope home in full dark, on fumes. Accounts from U.S. Navy historians and veterans put the late-day raid at well over 200 carrier aircraft, F6F Hellcats as escorts, with SB-2C Helldivers and TBF-TBM Avengers, fanned out over the Philippine Sea toward a fleet already wounded below the horizon. The wounds are real, and they are yesterday's doing. On 19th June, the brand-new armored deck flagship Taihō had taken a single torpedo from USS Albacore, SS-218. Design flaws and fume handling turned that one hit into a holocaust by afternoon, blowing the carrier apart. On the same day, USS Kavala, SS-244, put 3 torpedoes into the veteran Shōkaku. She went down at 11:50 N, 137:57 E, her wake a boiling grave. These are not just losses. They are the removal of flight decks, the only factories at sea that can regenerate an air battle by sundown. Now the dusk raiders hunt what is left. Over the western rim, the horizon fits with islands of spray as U.S. strike leaders sort silhouettes, Shōkaku, Hiyō, cruisers, battleships, escorts, while Hellcats claw down A6Ms trying to bar the approach. The torpedo squadrons take their turn, coming in low and level into a whipsaw of tracer. When the smoke lifts, Hiyō is finished. her hull broken by internal explosions after U.S. carrier aircraft, including VT-24 from USS Belleau Wood, CVL-24, put fish into her. She will slip under on the evening of 20th of June 1944, the third Japanese carrier to be lost in roughly 36 hours. The strike runs long. Some formations, misled by haze and evasive turns, push beyond their planned return windows. The sea is a black sheet by the time the first throttles ease back toward Task Force 58. Radios crackle. Fuel states are critical. Some crews are already ditching by starlight, others circling for what they hope is home. In the carrier's island bridges, the arithmetic is brutal. Keep the force dark and tight against submarine threat, or risk everything, every silhouette, to pull aviators from the sky. Mitscher chooses people. He orders 4 words no admiral had ever spoken over a Pacific fast carrier task force in combat. Turn on the lights. Ship by ship, the task force blooms, running lights, masthead lights, deck edge glow lights, even searchlights stabbing up as beacons. Some ships fire star shells to mark a path. It is reckless, and it is necessary. The human cost of the decision is paradoxical. Night recoveries at the very limit of endurance still claim machines and men. U.S. Navy summaries note that while the attack on Ozawa's fleet had been an unqualified tactical success, the long flight back and night recovery proved disastrous in their own right. Dozens of aircraft and aviators lost to fuel starvation, darkness, and the unforgiving geometry of a pitching deck. Yet the lights save scores who would otherwise have died. The wake of TF-58 is flecked with flares, and the phosphor of ditched aircraft as destroyers comb for survivors. The risk to the formation, submarines homing on a lit-up armada, is accepted, managed, and endured. On Ozawa's side of the horizon, the ledger is worse. His first mobile fleet has now lost Taihō, Shōkaku, and Hiyō in 2 days, along with hundreds of aircraft in the failed 19 June raids and the evening's intercepts. He can neither shield his remaining decks nor regenerate a coherent air wing by morning. U.S. Navy and standard campaign references converge on the scale. The Japanese will finish 19 to 20 June 1944 down 550 645 aircraft, with 3 carriers sunk, while TF-58 remains intact as a striking organism, blooded by night recovery losses but still dominant. Still on station over the Marianas lodgment it was built to protect. Causality is no mystery. Radar, CIC fighter direction, and a deep pilot pipeline set the table. Submarine ambushes removed the best decks. Hellcats enforced the geometry. An industrial scale gave Mitscher the margin to gamble at dusk, and still have an air group tomorrow. The lights finally go back out in the early hours. On the darkened hangar decks, exhausted ordnancemen coil lines and count empties. Pilots drink water that tastes like avgas and adrenaline. The sea is quiet, but the war has shifted. The Imperial Navy's carrier arm is broken in the Central Pacific, and the Marianas are now secured enough to become B-29 stepping stones to Tokyo. The next part of the story is arithmetic and consequence, what the 2 days cost, what they bought, and how those numbers bent the rest of 1944. By dawn on 21st June 1944, the math no longer lied. In just 48 hours, 19 to 20th June 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 3 carriers, Taihō, Shōkaku, and Hiyō, and the trained air groups that gave those decks meaning. U.S. and standard campaign references converge on the scale. 550, 645 Japanese aircraft destroyed across the 2 days, versus a far smaller U.S. total, leaving First Mobile Fleet unable to mount coherent follow-on strikes. The battle summary that students still memorize, 3 carriers sunk, 550 645 aircraft down, isn't a nickname. It's an order of battle turned into a necrology. The point of it was Saipan. Task Force 58 existed that week to keep the transports and fire support ships safe, while Marines and soldiers ground inland from the 15 June beachheads. Mitscher's umbrella did exactly that. With U.S. Fifth Fleet, Spruance, covering the lodgment and TF-58 flying the shield, the carriers absorbed and dismantled 4 major raid cycles on 19th June, and still had the stamina to throw a Hiyō 200-plane dusk strike on 20th June. The mission beyond darkness that finished Hiyō and shredded what remained of Ozawa's air groups. The recovery that followed, Mitscher's decision to turn on the lights across a submarine-haunted ocean, was costly in aircraft and aircrew, but it brought home scores who would have died otherwise and left the carrier force intact over the objective it was built to protect. Numbers. Frame why Ozawa could not answer on day 2. The fleets had sailed with a structural imbalance that radar, training, and submarines made fatal. U.S. sources placed TF-58 at about 7 fleet plus 8 light carriers to 900 embarked aircraft, with fast battleships, cruisers, and I-68 destroyers under a single fighter direction lattice. Opposite were 3 fleet plus 6 light, Japanese carriers with 450 carrier aircraft and 300 land-based planes scattered across the Marianas, figures that looked imposing on paper but masked a thin bench of experienced aircrew. When USS Albacore, SS-218, torpedoed Taihō and USS Kavala, SS-244, sank Shōkaku on 19th June, Ozawa's ability to rearm and relaunch massed waves collapsed with his flight decks. The evening of 20th June finished Hiyō. That is why the second day is an American strike and a Japanese search. The result at sea immediately widened the land fight's horizons. With the Marianas air-sea space secured, B-29 bases on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam could be developed into what the Joint Chiefs intended all along: a direct strategic bombing bridge to Tokyo. The battle's official framing from the naval history and heritage command is blunt. The Battle of the Itarifi, Philippine Sea, was fought several hundred miles west of Saipan during the Forager landings and effectively ended Japan's ability to conduct large-scale carrier actions. The causal chain runs clean: protect Saipan, break Japanese carrier aviation, unlock strategic bombing from the Marianas. For the Hellcat, the verdict blended technology and system. Grumman built 12,200 F6F F6Fs 1942-45 at peak literally 1 per hour, which meant that even after the hazardous night recoveries of 20 June, the fast carrier force could reconstitute squadrons and keep flying. Those F6Fs carried the same standardized battery that had defined the intercepts: 6 50 cal Brownings with 400 rounds per gun, 2,400 total. A blunt instrument that, married to radar vectoring and disciplined gunnery, turned merges into 50 cal curtains. Production and doctrine aren't color, they're causation. One last asymmetry decided the exchange ratios: human depth. While Japan's carrier arm bled veterans from 1942 to 43 and rushed replacements, the U.S. pipeline had already qualified Sakan 17,800-plus pilots for deck landings on the Great Lakes. Training carriers USS Wolverine, 964, and USS Sable, Knights 81, between 1942 to 45. Those hours bounced traps, waved off approaches, engine-out bolters, don't show up in kill tables, but they keep fighters serviceable and air groups regenerating in a way Ozawa could no longer match. So, the ledger after 19-20 June 1944 reads like a change of era. Japan's carrier aviation, reduced by 3 decks and hundreds of irreplaceable aircrew, no longer threatened the U.S. amphibious timetable in the Central Pacific. The Fifth Fleet kept its grip on the Marianas. The Hellcat's role: survivable, heavily armed, easy to fly and maintain, proved the thesis of systems warfare. Radar, CIC plus trained pilots, plus industrial scale beats mystique. In the next section, we'll track how that verdict played out across the rest of 1944. Through the aces, kill claims, and the debates around ratios, and what the numbers meant for morale on both sides. On the rosters that mattered to morale, one name became shorthand for the Hellcat's ceiling. Commander David McCampbell, Air Group 15, finished the war with 34 aerial victories, all in F6Fs, the U.S. Navy's top ace. His two signature days bracket the arc you've just watched. On June 19, 1944, in the first day of the Philippine Sea battle, McCampbell destroyed 7 Japanese aircraft, 5 in his first sortie, 2 in his second, while breaking up an inbound strike. 4 months later, on October 24, 1944, over Leyte, he downed 9 more in a single mission. An American record that still stands. Both actions anchor the Medal of Honor citation that explicitly ties his June 19th performance to the wider victory at the Marianas. Those heroics were not outliers. They were the sharp edge of a system. By the U.S. Navy's own historical accounting, Hellcat pilots claimed roughly 5,163 enemy aircraft, and produced an overall 19.1 air-to-air kill ratio across 1943-45, about 75% of all U.S. Navy aerial victories in the Pacific. The National Naval Aviation Museum and NHHC summaries put those numbers in one place for a reason. They're the cumulative product of 6 50-caliber guns, 2,400 rounds, survivability, armor and self-sealing tanks, radar-directed tactics, and a deep training pipeline that kept qualified aviators on deck. If the ratios look lopsided, the inputs were too. Production meant stamina. Grumman built 12,275 Hellcats, and at peak 1 rolled off the line about every hour, the kind of flow that lets a fast carrier force absorb night recovery losses on 20 June and still launch at tempo the next day. NHHC's aircraft pages make the point plainly, down to the specific variant, F6F5, and even McCampbell's markings on a museum example. Industrial scale wasn't background color. It was the enabler of operational rhythm. Against that scale, the A6M Zero brought an opposite design philosophy and, by 1944, a dwindling cadre of veteran pilots. Early war Zeros eschewed pilot armor and self-sealing tanks for range and turn. As losses mounted and training compressed, Japanese air groups met Hellcats under a radar-directed cap umbrella that forced them to fight in the high-speed, vertical regime where the Zero's controls went heavy and its vulnerabilities multiplied. The result on 19 to 20 June 1944 was systemic. Intercepts far forward, strike packages fragmented, and a 2-day attrition the IJN could not replace. 3 carriers lost and hundreds of aircraft gone. That asymmetry of design plus training plus doctrine plus industry is exactly what the post-battle tallies are measuring. Even so, professional history's caution against reading the 19-1 as a physics constant. Claims were recorded in the fog of large multi-axis engagements. Some overlap is inevitable, but the signal rises through the noise because independent lines converge. 1. The carrier loss ledger, Taihō, Shōkaku, Hiyō, and 2. The raid-by-raid breakdowns on June 19th both show catastrophic Japanese losses set against light U.S. air-to-air attrition. And 3. The training and production data explain why those outcomes persisted through 1944. In other words, even if you adjust individual claims downward, the qualitative storyline doesn't change. By mid-1944, the U.S. Navy was fighting a systems war that the IJN could no longer match. For air crews on deck, numbers translated into habits. Pilots learned to take altitude and sun, attack once in the vertical, and resist the turn fight. They trusted the CIC voices feeding them bearings and angels. They counted on armor and self-sealing to get them home if a pass went wrong. Those habits, multiplied across Task Force 58's air groups, produced the 50-call curtains that Hellcat crews remember from the Philippine Sea. A dense, short-burst pattern that punished fragile fuel systems and unarmored cockpits. The aces, McCampbell's 7, June 19th, and 9, Octa 24, Vraciu's 6 in 8 minutes, and dozens of less told days were simply the most visible outcomes of that doctrine. There is a human counterpoint to the metrics. Mitscher's decision to turn on the lights during the 20th of June recovery, a choice that risked submarines in order to save aviators, underscored how thoroughly personnel and machines were now being husbanded by a mature system. The fleet could take that risk because it had depth, destroyers to screen, radar to warn, fuel to fly again at dawn. The Imperial Navy, by contrast, expended irreplaceable pilots in a single operational throw. By 21st June 1944, the war in the Central Pacific had tipped into a phase where Hellcats enforced air supremacy while B-29 bases in the Marianas took shape, cause and effect locked together across the same 72 hours. When post-war compilers wrote that the F6F accounted for roughly 3/4 of Navy aerial victories, they weren't writing a boast. They were describing an architecture: rugged fighter, R-2800 power, 6 guns, radar-directed tactics, rotating squadrons, and an industrial base that never ran dry. In the Marianas, that architecture met an opponent optimized for a different war. Lighter, longer-legged, and fatally exposed to 50-cal fire once tactics and technology pushed the fight into the Hellcat's envelope. The ledger that started with June 1920 keeps paying forward through Leyte Gulf and beyond, and it explains why a throwaway pilot's phrase, "Turkey Shoot," still functions as a verdict. At dawn on 19th of June 1944, the sea looked the same as it had for centuries: flat, bright, indifferent. What changed was the way men met over it. The Hellcat did not win because it was mythic. It won because it was sensible. Thick skin, big engine, 6 guns that worked every time a thumb pressed down. A cockpit a pilot could live in when the world turned to fire. The A6M Zero had written the first chapters of the Pacific Air War. Range, agility, elegance. But by 1944, the fight no longer rewarded elegance alone. It rewarded a system: radar to see first, controllers to think fast, pilots trained in numbers no Navy had ever fielded, factories that never slept. The Hellcat was the instrument that translated that system into results. It carried 50-caliber certainty into the merge and came back out of it with a pilot who could fly again tomorrow. Perceptions lag reality. In Europe, some fighter elites dismissed naval types as heavy, blunt, unromantic. In the Central Pacific, the ledger answered. June 19th to 20 was not an argument. It was an audit. Raids detected far out. Intercepts stacked at altitude. Carriers that launched and recovered all day, then lit themselves in the night to bring home men who had flown too far. On the western horizon, 3 Japanese flight decks vanished. Over the beaches of Saipan, the air stayed American. The cost was felt in the quiet places. On hangar decks where ordnancemen counted empties. In ready rooms where a chair sat unclaimed. On destroyer fantails where searchlights probed for the last, small heads in the black water. Systems win wars. People pay for them. Mitscher's 4 words, "Turn on the lights," exposed that truth with a human clarity few orders ever have. When the battle ended, nothing about the sea had changed. The wind still smelled of salt and cordite. Brass still tinkled across wooden planks. But the carrier war had pivoted. The Marianas became runways to Tokyo, and the Hellcat's silhouette, broad wings, stubby chin, gun smoke feathering the slipstream, became the shape of a new kind of certainty. Not glamour, not mystique, just a durable machine serving a disciplined idea. History remembers the phrase, turkey shoot. Pilots remembered something simpler. They could see the enemy first, reach them fast, hit hard, and come home. And in that loop, see, reach, hit, return, the war's outcome was already written.